Hi there. I'm Geneva, and my family didn't just leave me behind. They erased me. They smiled at me across a table like I was a stranger, plotted behind closed doors, and tried to rip away everything I had fought to rebuild. How do you survive when the people who should love you most are the ones holding the knife? Before we dive in, tell me, have you ever been betrayed by someone you called family? What time are you listening to this, and where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. I genuinely want to hear your story. The morning air bit into my skin as I pushed open the door to the law office. Asheville in winter always felt colder than the thermometer admitted. Sterile white walls, plastic plants, and a clock that ticked too loudly. Nothing about this place resembled a home. I rubbed my hands together, not from the cold, but from the electricity crackling under my skin. I sat down at the long glass table, my reflection fractured beneath the surface. 32 years old, successful, self-made. Yet sitting there, I felt like the same abandoned teenager with nothing but a crumpled bus ticket and bruised pride. The door creaked. They entered together. Carolyn wore her best beige coat, a string of pearls clinging to her neck like a noose. Lyle shuffled behind her, hands buried deep in his jacket pockets, his eyes darting away from mine like a guilty child. Neither of them flinched when they saw me. No widening of the eyes, no recognition. Just a brief, polite nod, as if I were a paralegal here to fetch coffee. I stared at them, my heart a slow drumbeat against my ribs. I could have screamed. I could have collapsed. Instead, I smiled thinly and turned my gaze to the lawyer shuffling papers at the end of the table. "Ms. Holloway," he said, glancing between us awkwardly. "Shall we begin?" I nodded. My voice, when it came, was steady. "Let's." Throughout the meeting, they discussed legalities, transfers, settlements, escrow, without once addressing who I was. It wasn't that they had forgotten. It was worse. They had erased me, like I was a stain on their pristine narrative. Carolyn occasionally glanced my way, a tight smile plastered on her face. Lyle barely looked up at all. By the time I signed the last document, my fingers felt numb, and not from the cold. As we rose to leave, Carolyn tilted her head, voice syrupy sweet. "You should come by for dinner, dear, just the family. It's been too long." Family. The word coiled in my stomach like something rotten. I caught the glint in her eye, polished, rehearsed. This wasn't an olive branch. It was bait. Still, I paused. "Come now," she added, her tone lilting, like she was offering me a piece of candy. "It's time to heal old wounds, don't you think?" I said nothing for a moment. Logic screamed to walk away. Curiosity whispered otherwise. "Sure," I said finally, slipping my coat on. "Why not?" Outside, the afternoon had dimmed into the bruised purples of evening. I drove aimlessly for a while before ending up in front of a familiar house. Their house. Yellow paint peeling at the edges, the porch light flickering like a dying star. I sat there, engine humming under my palms. Part of me, a small, treacherous part, hoped the dinner might be real. That maybe, this once, it wasn't another game. 16 years ago, I had felt the same way, waiting at the train station with a backpack that didn't even have enough inside to keep me warm. Believing, foolishly, that someone would come back for me. I turned the ignition off and stepped out. The house loomed ahead, each window dark like an empty eye socket. I could still hear my mother's voice. "Families fight, but blood is blood." Except mine had been spilled, quietly, when they chose to forget I existed. I climbed the creaky front steps, my boots thudding softly against rotted wood. The porch light buzzed overhead. I hesitated with my hand on the doorbell. I wasn't stepping into my childhood home. I was stepping into enemy territory. The Holloway residence looked exactly as it did in my memories. Too pristine, too posed. The front porch was freshly swept, the bushes trimmed into perfect little spheres, and yet there was something hollow in the air, something sour beneath the scent of winter pine. I stepped inside, immediately greeted by the false warmth of overdone hospitality. The dining table was set like a magazine spread, white linens, polished silver, a crystal vase of roses at the center. All of it screamed effort, but none of it whispered love. Carolyn floated toward me, her smile stretched too wide. "We're so happy you're here, sweetheart. It's time we made things right." Lyle gave me a stiff nod from behind her, his eyes darting away like a dog waiting for the next command. I swallowed back my instincts and sat at the table, the china clinking slightly under my touch. This wasn't a dinner. It was a chess game, and I had just been maneuvered into my seat. We made small talk over dry chicken and lukewarm wine. Carolyn gushed about the neighborhood, about old friends who still asked about me, lies wrapped in sugar. My fork hovered over my plate as murmured voices drifted from down the hall. I excused myself to the bathroom, moving lightly, silently. Their voices sharpened as I drew closer to the study. Through the cracked door, I glimpsed a manila folder on the desk, bold black letters reading "Emergency Custody Petition." Carolyn's voice, hushed but sharp. "If she doesn't comply, we'll claim mental duress. Play the elder abuse card. Courts eat that up." Lyle chuckled, low and mean. "She won't see it coming. She still thinks she's smarter than us." My breath caught, cold and brittle. Betrayal this deep didn't blaze. It froze. It crystallized. I backed away slowly, heart pounding in my ears. I had walked into their home thinking maybe, just maybe, something could be salvaged. Foolish. I wasn't their daughter tonight. I was a mark. A liability to be neutralized. 16 years ago, I sat on a cracked plastic bench at a deserted bus station, clutching a letter in my shaking hands. I had poured everything into it, rage, hurt, desperate hope for some acknowledgement. A letter to my parents that I never sent, a letter that began with, "Please tell me why," and ended with, "I'll still love you anyway." I had thrown it away by morning. Hope was a crueler master than hate. It kept you tethered long after the ship had sunk. Back at the table, I folded my napkin neatly, placing it beside my untouched plate. I smiled up at Carolyn, who beamed like a stage mother. "So good of you to come," she said, pouring more wine into her glass. "Family's what matters in the end." I wondered if she rehearsed those lines in front of a mirror. I took a slow sip of water, steadying my breathing. The past and the present weren't separate wounds. They were the same knife, twisted twice. Carolyn leaned forward, eyes shining with manufactured affection. "We've missed you, you know." I smiled back, feeling the porcelain curve of my teeth. I smiled like a soldier hearing the enemy's surrender, knowing it was a trick. She smiled at me like I was a guest. I smiled back like I knew exactly what kind of war she had declared. The coffee in my hand had long gone cold, forgotten as I sat stiffly at the edge of the Holloway dining room. Laughter buzzed in the background, a little too loud, a little too forced. Carolyn's voice floated through the air, syrupy and strained. Every word from her lips sounded like it had been dipped in poison and polished to a high gloss. I smiled when I had to, nodded when it was expected, but inside, my muscles locked into a permanent brace. I wasn't here to heal. I was here to see how deep the rot really ran. Later that afternoon, Nadine called. She asked if I could swing by the bakery, said there were some old boxes she wanted help sorting through. Grateful for any excuse to escape the tension, I agreed. Inside the tiny storeroom, the scent of flour and cinnamon wrapped around me like an old blanket. Nadine pulled out a battered shoebox from under a pile of yellowed newspapers. "Found this cleaning out the attic," she said, patting the lid. "Might be something you want." I lifted the lid and froze. Inside, crammed between crinkled envelopes and faded photographs, was a letter in my own childish scrawl, or so it seemed at first glance. My fingers trembled as I read it. The words sliced like glass. Accusations against Carolyn and Lyle. Descriptions of tantrums and threats I supposedly hurled as a child. It was a lie, a fabrication, a weapon. Richard's signature at the bottom confirmed it. They had created a false paper trail to explain my disappearance, to justify abandoning me to anyone who asked. She was troubled, they could say. She was dangerous. I dropped the letter back into the box as if it burned. Later that evening, Driven by a gnawing unease, I accessed the old shared accounts Carolyn once used for family expenses. The passwords were old habits she never bothered to change. There it was, buried among dentist bills and pharmacy receipts, transactions from a nearby casino, all dated the week after I had sent money for what I was told was Lyle's emergency surgery. $15,000, blown away like autumn leaves in a gambler's fever. I slumped back in my chair, my chest tight with a hurt so sharp it almost felt surgical. They hadn't needed me to save Lyle. They had needed me to finance their latest shot at a miracle that never came. 16 years ago, I had stared at a cracked bus station floor, clutching a $20 bill Carolyn pressed into my hand with a kiss that smelled like coffee and betrayal. "You're tough, baby girl," she had said, already walking away. "You'll figure it out." The old wounds reopened in an instant, raw and bleeding. I stared at the blinking screen, the cold digits of betrayal laid out in perfect rows. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. Some parts of grief were too exhausted to make noise anymore. In silence, I moved through the house. My hand brushed against Carolyn's purse hanging by the door. A receipt poked out, peeking like a guilty secret. I pulled it free. One last gamble at the casino. One last roll of the dice, with my forgiveness as the jackpot. I folded the receipt carefully, sliding it into my coat pocket. Love, I realized, was a currency they had spent long before they asked for my forgiveness. The smell of cinnamon and old wood wrapped around me as I pushed open Nadine's bakery door. Bells chimed overhead, scattering the heavy fog that had been clinging to my shoulders since the night before. Nadine stood behind the counter, wiping down trays with mechanical focus, but her eyes flickered up when she saw me. "You look like you've been chewing on nails," she said, voice low and familiar. "I found something," I replied, the weight in my chest making every word feel like it was dragging iron chains behind it. We moved to the back, the old storeroom creaking under our steps. Nadine handed me a thin stack of papers, yellowed at the edges. "Found it in an old cookie tin, figured you'd want to see it first." I sifted through them with trembling hands. Tucked between faded school report cards and forgotten birthday cards was the dagger, a series of emails between Richard and Carolyn, dated 16 years ago. Their subject lines were clinical, almost corporate: plan for custody adjustment, contingency for behavioral claims. The words blurred before my eyes. They hadn't just abandoned me. They had planned it like a hostile acquisition, documented, signed, sealed. 16 years ago. I remembered Richard patting my head awkwardly, telling me, "You're a handful, kiddo, but someday you'll understand we had no choice." I had thought it was clumsy affection. It was a rehearsed goodbye. I stood there frozen, my breath fogging the musty air, while betrayal seeped into every crack of my skin. Later that day, I met Dean Foster at the law office downtown. The building loomed gray and clinical, a monument to cold negotiations. Inside, Carolyn and Lyle were already seated, their faces a study in performative innocence. Carolyn's lipstick was a shade too bright. Her smile was stretched thin enough to snap. Lyle fiddled with a pen like a guilty schoolboy. As Dean laid out the transfer documents, Carolyn leaned forward, voice trembling just enough to sound believable. "We didn't realize," she said, blinking rapidly. "She manipulated us. We thought we could trust her." My hands tightened in my lap. Dean shifted uncomfortably, glancing at me for permission to respond. I shook my head slightly. I reached into my briefcase and slid a thick manila envelope across the table. Every debt they had defaulted on, every tax lien, every foreclosure notice they had pretended didn't exist. The silence cracked like ice underfoot. Carolyn's mouth opened and closed, no sound escaping. Dean cleared his throat. "All documents are verified. Ownership transfer is legal and binding. Any further claims would be inadvisable." Lyle slumped in his chair, defeated. Carolyn's cheeks flushed a violent red, but her voice, when it came, was a hiss. "You ungrateful little—" I rose before she could finish. I didn't flinch. I didn't shout. I didn't even look back. There was nothing left to say to people who had practiced my erasure with such precision. Outside, the wind had sharpened. slicing down the empty street. As I approached my car, something caught my eye. A crumpled envelope shoved under my windshield wiper. I pulled it free. The handwriting was shaky, the paper thin with moisture, but the message inside was sharp enough to slice through bone. The letter crumpled in my lap as my eyes moved over the typed threats. No signature, no official header, just the polished venom of someone who thought fear could still crack me open. It read, "Drop the matter or face the consequences. Family always pays its debts, one way or another." The phrasing was too precise, too Carolyn. I could almost hear her syrupy voice cooing into the receiver of some burner phone, coaching whoever had typed it. It was the same tactic she'd used when I was 15 and dared to tell a school counselor about the bruises nobody wanted to see. "You misunderstood," she had said, patting my hand. "You have such a vivid imagination." I smoothed the letter flat against my knee and folded it twice, tucking it into the glove compartment without a word. I would not flinch. Not for them. Not anymore. Later that evening, Nadine met me at the bakery. She wore her old denim jacket, dusted with flour, and carried a battered folder under one arm. "Found this stuffed in a shoebox you left behind," she said, handing it over without ceremony. Inside, mixed with old school reports and faded birthday cards, was a draft of a legal custody relinquishment form, my name printed neatly at the top, Geneva Holloway, child to be relinquished. The form wasn't signed, but it didn't need to be. 16 years ago, I remembered hearing whispers behind half-closed doors, words I was never meant to catch. "She's not cut out for this family. It would be easier without the burden." I was the burden. They hadn't simply abandoned me at the station out of panic. They had prepared for it, planned it, considered it the neatest solution to an inconvenience that refused to fade into the wallpaper like a good daughter should. I sat back on Nadine's cracked leather couch, feeling something inside me shift. It wasn't anger. Not this time. It was a clean break, a cold understanding. Love had been a transaction to them, measured in convenience, weighted against appearances. When I ceased to be profitable, they filed me away like an unpaid bill. I stared at the form until the words blurred, then folded it carefully and slid it into my purse. 16 years ago, I had clung to the fantasy that my family's betrayal was an accident, a momentary lapse of judgment fueled by fear and misunderstanding. That if I worked hard enough, loved deeply enough, I could make them see me. Today, I buried that fantasy alongside whatever affection I still had for them. Outside, the streetlights flickered on, casting long, trembling shadows across the cracked pavement. I walked slowly to my car, the cold biting into my cheeks, the wind tugging at my coat. I pulled out the unsigned custody paper, holding it against the pale wash of the streetlight. They hadn't abandoned me in Boston. They had abandoned me long before the plane ever took off. I sat across from Jenna Carter, the faint buzz of her office heater filling the uncomfortable silence. She flipped through manila folders with a casual efficiency that belied the bomb she was about to drop. "You're going to want to see this," she said, sliding a packet across the desk. Inside were transaction records, property deeds, signatures that, at first glance, looked almost normal, except they weren't. Years ago, while I was still trying to survive, Carolyn and Lyle had quietly sold off the plot of land my grandfather had left me, the only real inheritance I had ever been promised. The paperwork was neat, legal, cold. They had pocketed the money, never said a word. The walls around me seemed to constrict, the air going thin. I nodded numbly, forcing out a tight, "Thank you," before slipping the documents into my bag. Outside, the sky was a harsh, unbroken gray. I drove without thinking, my hands stiff on the steering wheel until my phone buzzed. A notification, then another, and another. I pulled over on the shoulder, heart hammering in my ears. The posts were everywhere. Carolyn had taken to Facebook, long, winding paragraphs about betrayal, about an ungrateful daughter who abandoned her poor, sickly parents after everything we sacrificed for her. Photos, too. Carefully curated shots of Lyle looking gaunt, Carolyn looking teary, their house framed just so to appear crumbling and tragic. Friends, old neighbors, even distant cousins I hadn't spoken to in years were chiming in. Judgment sharpened into sentences, slicing through the screen. Family doesn't turn its back on you. She's chasing money over blood. How could she do this to them? My lungs locked. My fingers hovered uselessly over the screen. 16 years ago, sitting alone on a frozen bus bench, I had imagined that the worst thing anyone could do was leave you. I was wrong. The worst thing was staying behind to rewrite the story where you were the villain all along. I scrolled further. Private messages, some from people I barely remembered, scolding me, shaming me. My hands shook, not with fear but fury, white hot and clean. I could have blasted back. I could have posted proof. The deeds, the debts, the documents showing exactly who had destroyed what. But what would that make me? Another Holloway playing victim for the highest bidder? I slid the phone into my pocket. Silence would be my sword. I would gather my evidence. I would strike once. And when I did, there would be no doubt left standing. In the meantime, I would let them build their pyre higher. Stack lie upon lie. Let the crowd circle tighter. Let them scream for a scapegoat. They wanted a public execution. I would give them a reckoning instead. The cafe buzzed around me, voices layering over each other like static. I kept my head down, scrolling through Megan Walsh's latest post. The title alone was enough to split the air. The Holloway Hoax, When Family Becomes Fiction. Screenshots, financial records, testimonies from neighbors. Megan had laid it all out, brutal and unflinching. Within hours, the tide shifted. Public sympathy drained from Carolyn and Lyle like water from a cracked bucket. The comments started swinging, first cautious, then furious. Looks like someone's fairy tale just shattered. Maybe the daughter wasn't the villain after all. Vindication was supposed to taste sweet. Instead, it settled on my tongue like old pennies. I wasn't celebrating. There was no trophy for proving you were the one telling the truth all along. Just a dull ache where hope used to be. Still, a corner of my mind unclenched. They couldn't rewrite the story now. Not completely. Later that week, Nadine tugged me toward a local community center. "Just come for a few minutes," she insisted, patting my shoulder. "You can leave whenever you want." I agreed, mostly because I owed her. Partly because a small, battered part of me still wanted to believe some spaces were safe. The room was warm, buzzing with chatter and laughter. Folding chairs lined the walls, plates of cookies and weak coffee stationed by the windows. I barely had time to take it all in before the air shifted. Carolyn and Lyle appeared at the door, looking every bit the broken, desperate parents they had painted themselves to be online. Lyle leaned heavily on a cane I knew he didn't need. Carolyn clutched a worn handkerchief, dabbing at dry eyes. Before I could react, they moved toward me and dropped to their knees. Gasps rippled through the room. Conversations stalled mid-sentence. Every eye turned toward me. Carolyn's voice cracked theatrically. "We're so sorry, Geneva. Please, forgive us. We're your parents. We made mistakes. Terrible mistakes." Lyle echoed her like a bad actor, voice shaking just enough. "We lost our way, but blood is blood, baby girl." I stood there, feeling the crowd's gaze weighing heavier by the second. Sympathetic murmurs curled around me, subtle but insistent. Give them a chance. Family's family. She's their only daughter. The old trap, baited perfectly. But I saw it. In the way Carolyn's hand clutched the hem of her coat too tightly. In the flicker of calculation behind her glassy eyes. They didn't want forgiveness. They wanted a photo. A soundbite. Proof that the story had a happy ending. Proof that I, too, could be weaponized against myself. My heartbeat steadied. The old panic didn't come. I took one slow step back. "Stand up," I said, my voice slicing clean through the heavy air. This stage was never mine to perform on. The room froze. Carolyn's hand, still half hidden by her coat, clenched into a white-knuckled fist. The apartment was too quiet. The kind of silence that clung to the walls, thick and heavy. I sat at the kitchen table, Megan's message still glowing on my phone screen. It was staged, she had written. Photos were already sent to the local paper before the event even started. I leaned back in my chair, the cheap wood groaning under my weight. No remorse, no redemption, just another performance. Another way to twist the story until the only villain left standing wore my face. No more. The next morning they called, Carolyn's voice syrupy sweet, masking steel underneath. We've thought about everything, honey. We know this has all been hard, but if you'd help pay off our debt, we could rebuild, as a family. There it was, the final hand played. Or, she continued, her tone sharpening like a blade, people might think it was you who ruined us. It's your word against ours. I listened, my grip tightening on the phone, not because it surprised me, because it didn't. You think you can buy your way out of this? She hissed when I didn't answer. Think again. I hung up without a word. They wanted me to pay for their sins, to carry the weight of their failure stitched onto my back like some grotesque badge of honor, to prove I was the dutiful daughter willing to sacrifice herself for a family that had long since sold her out. That afternoon, a letter arrived at my office. A formal warning, if I didn't comply, they would pursue legal action for elder abuse. An accusation as thin as paper, but loud enough to do damage if it caught fire. Dean Foster met me in his office, grim-faced. We can fight it, he said simply. We have the evidence. Let them come. I nodded once, feeling something inside me settle. I wasn't the same girl anymore, the one who thought love could be earned if you bled enough for it. Now I understood. Some wolves wear smiles, some wear blood ties, and sometimes the only way to survive is to stop pretending they were ever family to begin with. That night, under the harsh fluorescence of my living room, I drafted a letter. No emotion, no apologies, just boundaries and consequences. I sealed it carefully, the paper trembling only slightly between my fingers. This time, I would not survive them. I would end them. The morning was gray, the kind of muted cold that clung to your skin. I stared at the blank ceiling above my bed, listening to the distant hum of traffic. My phone buzzed once, then again. I didn't move. When I finally picked it up, the news was waiting. Carolyn and Lyle had left town in the middle of the night. No forwarding address, no fanfare, just an empty house and a mountain of unpaid bills in their wake. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't even feel relieved. It was a strange kind of hollow, like standing on a battlefield long after the fighting had stopped, surrounded only by echoes and dust. By noon, I had pulled out every document tied to them, custody drafts, bank statements, eviction notices. I sorted them into neat piles, each sheet a monument to every lie, every betrayal. One by one, I fed them into the fireplace. The unsigned custody letter burned last. The flames curled around the edges first, turning my mother's delicate cursive into nothing but ash. I watched without blinking, the heat kissing my skin, purging something deeper than anger or sadness. Healing, I realized, wasn't a grand explosion. It was small, brutal acts of letting go. At sunset, I drove across town. The old warehouse we had spent months renovating now stood ready. Fresh paint, new locks, hope stitched into every corner. The sign above the door read, "Resurge Home." Inside, the air smelled like fresh lumber and something sweeter. Possibility. Nadine was already there, unpacking kitchen supplies and setting loaves of bread on the counter like quiet blessings. "You did good, kid," she said, squeezing my shoulder. I smiled, tired but steady. We did. Later, as twilight bled into evening, I stood outside on the worn concrete steps. A girl approached slowly, a backpack slung over one shoulder, a wary look in her eyes that I recognized too well. I opened the door without asking questions. 16 years ago, no one had opened a door for me. 16 years ago, I had been left sitting in the cold, carrying a letter no one would ever read. Not this time. Maybe healing didn't look like forgiveness. Maybe it looked like opening a door someone else tried to close forever. Sometimes the wounds that shape us aren't the ones you can see. They are the empty spaces left by promises broken, doors closed, and hands that never reached back. I spent years believing that survival meant carrying those wounds like armor. But true healing, true freedom, came when I realized I could build something new from the ruins. You don't have to be defined by who walked away or who tried to bury you. You are not the scars they left. You are the strength you chose to create. Forgiveness isn't always a gift you owe. Sometimes it's the peace you claim for yourself. If this story resonated with you, I would love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had to break free from something or someone that was supposed to protect you? Share your experience in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from, or simply drop a 1 if this touched your heart. And if you believe in stories that remind us we can rebuild, no matter how broken the foundation, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps keep these stories alive, and more are waiting just around the corner. Stay strong, stay true, and thank you for being part of this journey.